Well, it's a great honor to welcome you, Jonah, to Scandinavia. I'm saying Scandinavia because then I can include Denmark in the.
Lovely.
I'm not going to introduce you too much, but I mean you're obviously incredibly accomplished together with your big brother. You are the sort of brain behind Memento and the Dark Knight series, The Prestige, Interstellar, and lately also you gave birth to a Person of Interest, and lately together with your wife, Lisa Joy, the rebirth of Westworld, which has definitely kept me hooked to HBO the last 3 years. I want to talk about a few things. One of them is Memento. I think Memento was the first time I sort of stumbled upon your work. You wrote the short story that sort of inspired the film, and I found it in some sort of small art house cinema in Copenhagen by accident. And I was trying to call around to get someone to come and watch it with me. And I couldn't find anyone, so I ended up going alone to the cinema, which feels slightly suspect. And then not knowing what I was going to see. And then afterwards, I had such a profound need to talk about this film with someone. So the next day, I went straight out and hijacked a friend and went to the cinema and watched it again. So we could get it out of my system.
Repeat business. That's mainly what we were going for with that movie, was repeat business.
Yeah, exactly. It totally, you definitely got my krona there. But I think what was so amazing about the film is that I think it's one of the best or clearest examples of the complete fusion between medium and message, or as we say in architecture, form and function. That in a way it portrays a condition and a story where you could not tell it in a conventional way. So you had to reinvent the medium. And I'd like to just hear you talk a little bit about that, how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we always try to start from a place of shaping the narrative to the protagonist's point of view. And what was so interesting about that story was you had a protagonist whose point of view was completely broken. So you say, well, how do you map that point of view onto a story? And I struggled. I was writing it as a short story, and I shared my early drafts with my brother, who then started writing it as a screenplay. And we were going back and forth. For myself, the ultimate form that I settled on as the best representation of the protagonist's kind of broken mind, but I got too lazy and I didn't actually finish it, was to write the story as a deck of cards that you would shuffle. So that your experience of his story would be fragmentary and random, like his. Chris then called me up, because of course with a movie you can't do that, not in a movie theater. And Chris called me and said, I've cracked it, I want the film to be backwards. And I said, that's the stupidest idea you've had yet. keep thinking. But ultimately, he was, it's an oversimplification to say the structure of that film is backwards. It's not quite backwards. It moves backwards and forwards incrementally together towards a sort of a point of reunion. But it was a really fun example for me of allowing the theme and the story to dictate the form of it, but also really exciting for us to realize just how elastic the audience's understanding of narrative was. Yeah. I mean, audiences are extraordinary at grasping and grappling with narrative. Sometimes too good, and kind of hooked on finding fresh ways to explore it. So it was a really fun challenge.
I also noticed that sometimes you actually use physical forms as a way to explain a story. I mean, I've heard you say like a Mobius strip about Memento, and I have this feeling that like in architecture and design, there's like typology, which is similar to genre, like in film, and then there's topology, which is the attribute of a form. And I think in a lot of your films, just like there is a topology of Memento, the way that it's put together, that enables you to transmit a certain sensibility. And I think you've done it You've done it in Interstellar for sure. You've definitely done it in Westworld. Like, maybe tell a little bit of like, maybe you have some kind of synesthetic sensibility between form and narrative.
Very much. I was embarrassed the other day realizing how many projects I've worked on that people online have had to graph.
Yeah.
That doesn't really feel like success as an artist. But it's true. We do often wind up thinking about a formal structure to what we're pulling together in narrative terms. Very much in Memento, again in The Prestige, which has the three. That film announces the form it's going to take in saying the magic trick has three parts, and then we intercut the three acts of the film together so that you're experiencing them all simultaneously. And then Westworld was the first example, and spoiler alert for people who haven't seen the first season, the first example of a hidden topology. So as you're watching it the first time, you think, oh, good, finally, no more tricks, no more nonsense, regular story.
Yeah, exactly.
And then just at the end, we tried to pull a rug out and explain that you've actually been watching 2 or 3 timelines simultaneously because of the loop-like nature. So there's an awful lot of more moments than I would care to admit where we have to resort to the whiteboard and get up there and draw the shape of the story that we're trying to tell.
Yeah, and I think sort of that's also I think what's drawn me to like all the things that you've done is that, for instance, in architecture, we have something called a design narrative, which is the way we explain why a building ends up working and looking the way it does. I think you're the master of something that I would call narrative design, which is not like the conventional form of storytelling, but a much more sort of diagrammatic, almost architectural way of putting a story together.
Well, high praise from you, thank you. But we do love playing with it, and it does feel, I mean, we basically make the movies that we wanted to see growing up, and I think rather than trying to please an audience, with all due respect to the audience, I don't know how to do that. We just know how to please ourselves. You sort of make these things to entertain yourself first and foremost, and then you hope that there are enough people in the world who are similarly inclined that you get to do it again.
Yeah. And another thing that I think sort of, obviously your different stories are, like, it looks like you have like a lot of different interests, like a story about magicians, a story about a guy with sort of amnesia, but quite a few of them have to do with science fiction. Yeah. And science fiction is a genre that I've always been very fascinated by, because I think it's quite meaningful in many ways. And I think the person who explains it the best is Philip K. Dick. And his definition of science fiction is that science fiction is not a space opera, although it often happens in space. It's not a story from the future, although it often takes place in the future. It is a story where the plot is triggered by some form of innovation or invention. It's often a technological invention, but it can also be a social, political, cultural, biological, environmental invention. And the whole story becomes a narrative exploration of the potential consequences of that one altered fact. So in a way, you look at the world as you know it, and then you have these like trickling consequences by changing just one element. And I think almost in any creative endeavor, like that's really how we try to design, is to sort of imagine this is how the world is. What if we change one thing? What's going to happen?
That's a great quote. It's also in Philip K. Dick's inimitable style, gentle, subtle advice for writers about how to write science fiction. Just do the one big idea. Don't try to have 9 big ideas in there. But it's all. I think science fiction most explicitly lays bare what I think is happening with storytelling, and this is something that I've long been fascinated by. It's how I make my living. And in Westworld, we're really able to grapple with it explicitly because that's a show about a park where they build narrative. The best I can define storytelling is that it's a simulation. At a certain point, human beings gathered the ability to communicate ideas back and forth, and then shortly thereafter started sitting around a campfire and saying, "What if?" Yeah. And a lot of these stories are about how do you deal with the moral consequences of treachery? How do you deal with, why are so many of the stories that we're interested in about crime or about deception or about the worst possible things that could happen? It's as if the human psyche is collectively trying to prepare itself for eventualities, just think through the ethics of certain situations. I mean, when I was in school, we were reading the Odyssey and the Iliad, and our teacher explained that they were ways for the Greeks to communicate the values of their society to youth.
Yes.
Because young people wouldn't sit there and talk about, sit through an ethics lesson necessarily, but they would definitely listen to a war story.
Yes, yes.
Science fiction, I think, is the most explicit version of that, because you are literally trying to figure out, what do we want our world to look like? And what would happen if we changed it this way? So, I mean, Philip K. Dick, great advice in terms of, if you want to tell a science fiction story, maybe just choose the one thing you're changing, one variable, so you can consider, and everything else kind of a control, consider what happens if you change the one variable.
I love the idea of a simulation. You can almost say that the narrative of the story, or storytelling, or telling stories back and forth, is almost like the Forge, or like some of the servers where you can test out a potential sort of a host plot without actually doing all the damage.
Absolutely, yeah. And the whole rules of narrative design, the way that you put these things together, you have to be very careful in filmmaking. The technical term for it is suturing, right? So the grammar of your film in the first 5 minutes, you're literally suturing the audience into the narrative, right? And you have to be very careful not to disturb that, so that they can see the world as the protagonist. And I mean, it's a very explicit thing that we're doing. It's a very weird thing that we're doing. Humans are very strange, is the short version.
I think also one thing that I think is an incredible accomplishment with Westworld is that you basically take essentially a B movie with a rather basic but brilliant idea from the late 70s. I actually watched the original. I tried rewatching it recently. It's really hard to rewatch, I have to say, but I remember it like there was both like sex and violence for like a 10-year-old. That was like amazing. But I think what you've done is that you've taken that like kind of basic. Yeah, so it's Michael Crichton who did the original one before he became a writer, and it is basically Jurassic Park with robots.
Very much.
But you take that and then you turn it into a very, very profound, and I think one of the most profound and sophisticated explorations of human nature, human consciousness, and maybe the advent of a new form of non-organic humanity, in a way. I'd like to sort of maybe hear a little bit like the journey about like how early did you understand the potential of what you were actually working with Westworld?
Well, just to defend Michael Crichton a little bit.
Yes.
I watched the movie when I was 10 as well, and I think I responded probably to the same things that you did. Fantastically creepy, the brilliance of Yul Brynner literally wearing the costume that he wore in Magnificent Seven, the way that it's playing with form, but it also has a few ideas in it that are really, really fascinating, a couple of which we've already grappled with, some of which you don't quite understand the sophistication of it. So as an example, there's a moment in the original film where one of the lead scientists is talking to the other lead scientist, and they're saying, well, how is this propagating from one machine to the other? And the other scientist says, it's almost spreading like a disease, like a virus. And you go, oh, okay, right, computer virus, got it.
It was quite funny, they actually used the word bacteria.
Yes.
So it was before
Well, so I was curious, because I think, oh, okay, this is the usual movie cheesy version of a computer virus. So I looked it up. He wrote the film 2 years before the first computer virus appeared in the wild.
Yeah.
So here's a guy who is, I mean, Crichton was brilliant, a polymath. He had his, he was a medical doctor. He was an entrepreneur. He was a fascinating guy. And he probably more so than any other popular author I could point at, understood that Philip K. Dick idea of here comes technology, and one idea at a time, it's going to really, really mess with us. There's another line in that scene where, by way of an explanation for what's happening, the scientist says, in some cases, these circuits have been designed by other machines, and we don't know how they work. That's one line. We're still exploring that in our show. And that's the world that we're about to step into. the world in which machines are making other machines. And we no longer understand on a sort of an ontological level what's happening, right? We're about to become 2 degrees removed from our creations. And so that's something we were fascinated by. But for us, the conception of the project, I had seen the original film, age 10. My wife had not. And the fact that Lisa had not watched it was the reason the project exists. Because I couldn't quite see how you extrapolated that out into a series. I kept getting stuck in the kind of Love Boat version of it. Right?
Yeah.
This week, Dolores helps a couple work through their marital problems. Lisa saw the whole thing, and Lisa said, this is everything that we're interested in. This is everything we're talking about. Yes, it's artificial intelligence, but it's also on a hopefully profound level about human identity and human identity in this moment that we're stepping into where the world has become much more complicated. So it's really about human behavior, but it's about human behavior through the lens of creatures who have been designed to look like us and embody our, potentially very broken mindset. And so, she'd figured it out. She understood exactly what it could be. So we jumped in, and it felt like if you watch the original film, part of the reason why the original film is interesting is that it's so breathless with ideas for 92 minutes that you thought, oh yeah, you know what? There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I also think like that second fragment from the scene where they said that they've been designed by other machines, so we don't really know how they work.
Yeah,
I think that's really one of the more profound dilemmas we're going to be facing now, because like increasingly we can see that neural networks can be taught to make great decisions, and empirically we can see that they make better decisions than a human professional, like sort of like X-ray diagnostics or like all kinds of like, of course, like narrow scope, but much better decisions. But because they are neural networks, they have not been programmed. They're not running on a code that we wrote for them. Yeah. They have made their own experiences, but in a way we can't read their minds in the same way that we can't read the mind of another human. But at some point we're going to have to sort of ask ourselves, do we trust AI to make better decisions than we can, like we would trust the best person in the room?
Yeah.
Or would we rather write rules that will give us inferior decisions?
Yeah.
But that we can control because we actually created it ourselves.
And this is, I think, the big question of our age, right? This is the moment in which we start to take our hands off the wheel. I mean, quite literally. When we were doing the first season, we had a Tesla, as many people in Norway do. And our car, as we were making the show, taught itself how to drive. And it would update itself I was in the beta group for the self-driving capability, and we started shooting the pilot, and it was basically a regular car. And by the time we're shooting the finale, it was driving us home from set. And that first moment, I remember the first night coming home, because you're tired, you've been shooting. So, I was very excited for the car to start driving. But the first moment you take your hands off the wheel and you feel it steering at 70, 80 miles an hour around a bend, it's a very unnerving moment, but it's a good metaphor, I think, for what, and the show notwithstanding. It may not be apparent, I am a techno-optimist, not apparent from the show, although things are working out great for the robots. I think, personally, for what it's worth, that we're going to have to learn to cede a little bit of control, because the systems aren't just going to be better at driving than we are. And I think it's our vanity notwithstanding, it's very apparent that within a few years, cars will be vastly better at driving than we are. They never get distracted. They never take their eyes off the road. They can react almost instantaneously. So yeah, they're not as good as we are now, but they will be very, very quickly. That's not just about driving. That's also about systems of governance, right? I mean, some fascinating talks here earlier talking about city governance. Systems are very good at these things. They're not corrupt. This is a problem we're dealing with in America right now, a little bit. The idea that your elected officials may not actually be working in your best interest, but if there's a system there. And obviously, these are very difficult questions to solve, but they're not impossible, and they're not quite as novel as you might appreciate. I mean, one of the thought experiments that we've had sort of talking in the room a little bit when you talk about algorithms governing the world. Well, what is the US Constitution as one example? It's an algorithm. It's a very durable one. And it has a mechanism whereby you can change it a little bit. It's maybe not adaptive enough is one of the problems. But it's a very durable one. It's worked quite well. And so that idea of formalizing rules, but you're right. I mean, one of the underlying things with deep learning is you can't really get under the hood, and the machine can't necessarily tell you why it made the decision that it made. So we're going to have a very difficult decision ourselves to make in a few years when we figure out if we want to, give up control.
I love what you're saying about the Constitution, because we are actually trying to grapple within. Obviously, we are a creative design agency. Our sort of DNA is about innovation and not repeating ourselves. Exploring things, coming up with surprising solutions. So you would say it might be not so, because automation has always been about taking the most mechanical part of the job and making it more effectively. But I am quite interested in trying to do it, and what you're saying about the Constitution is that the way we're trying to look at it is to try to describe more formally what are the things we do when we start a project, and in a way trying to think of it as writing a software that is not going to be running on a computer, it's going to be running on people.
Yeah.
And then, once you've sort of been, so as a way of making it more systematic, these are the things you should do. So trying to sort of, in a way, productize what it is we're doing, but not as a way of eliminating surprises or innovation, but actually by getting to it faster. And I think a major part of how things evolve, starting with Darwin's idea of evolution through adaptation, is through excess and selection. Yeah, there has to be a huge variety of individuals or possible outcomes, and then there's the selection criteria. So increasingly, I think we will have to harness that tireless ability to simulate in order to actually become really genuinely creative.
Yeah, very much. Well, and that's the big question for us, in sort of creative professions. I mean, I joke with my mom all the time because I was the baby of the family. I'm the third kid. Neither of my older brothers were particularly interested in getting respectable jobs. My middle brother was convinced he was going to be a film director from the age of 5. And my mom held out hope that I would be the one who got a real job. And I laugh with her every year about how lucky we are that I didn't go get a real job, because all of the jobs she wanted me to get have started to become
disappearing.
Yeah, they're becoming automated.
Yeah.
And my joke with her is that I've been saved by idiom, right? I mean, literally, it's the last thing that I'll hold on to when I think about how to automate my job. The challenge there is, I don't write comedy, but how do you teach a machine to tell a good joke? And I feel like that'll probably be the last bastion of human creative enterprise. The last thing we're really good at is writing jokes, right? Everything else will be gone. We'll just have comedy clubs. That's where we'll all be employed. But it's an interesting question. I mean, if I could create a piece of software
for an audience of robots.
For an audience of robots. Yeah. Now
so funny.
That's tricky. But that's the question, I think, and I'd love to hear, how much you're excited to have automation become. Automation doesn't do it justice.
No.
If you say artificial inspiration, artificial creativity becoming part of what you do, because it feels like there's an opportunity in architecture, and we were talking about this a little bit the other day, to achieve things now with 3D printing, with artificially enhanced design to create and even conceive of structures that you couldn't possibly have thought of in a non-AI moment.
Yeah, but I think in a way, I really profoundly think that AI is somehow going to be our children.
Yeah.
They're not going to be biological.
Yeah.
They're somehow informed and educated by us, but they will, just like our children, they will take on a life of their own.
Right.
But the way I see it, from the point of view of designer. I became an architect because I like to draw. I thought I was going to be a cartoonist. In the absence of a cartoon academy, I ended up in architecture school. But then I was so good at drawing, then I had to learn to draw with I was doing with watercolors and crayons. Then I had to learn to draw with a hard line and a ruler. And I lost some of the touch that I had with the more free drawing, but I gained some control that I could construct really complex perspectives. Then I started, drawing on the computer, and again, I didn't have the feeling of the paper and the ink, but I could then suddenly look at it from different angles. I could produce. So I lost some of my control, but I gained a world of possibilities. And then eventually, I'll say at this point, I've graduated into drawing with other people.
Right.
So they are somehow the ones doing the creative job. I would say that it's still, I feel fully realized, and I can definitely, I feel I can rightfully take the credit for a lot of the stuff, but so can they.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, I think that's what will happen, that we will still be here. There'll still be roles for us.
Yes.
But we will have these amazing colleagues. Also, you'll have an amazing writing team in the form of an AI that can generate sort of completely unexpected narratives for you to sort of bounce ball with.
Yeah, very much. That's the hope. Or we'll all be enslaved by the robots.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of one or the other.
But I think before we open up to the audience, we also consumed a lot of time. I just wanted to ask you, since now you are deeply involved with trying to visualize the future.
Yes.
And I normally explain, if I have to make architecture sound cool, I say architecture is giving form to the future. Giving form to the future you want to find yourself living in. What are some of the things and also in season 3, it seems like we're going to go to the outside world. Are there some fragments of the future that you've identified that we might look forward to?
That's why I'm here. You guys are supposed to tell me what the FutureTalks. That's what I came for. No, I mean, we're interested in presenting a vision of the future. I've always thought of the future. I'm old enough now that I've seen various versions of the future come and go. And it's always surprising, but it's always also a little bit disappointing. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, my joke is we were promised jetpacks, we got Instagram.
Yeah. Kind of sums it up.
Yeah. So we want to give the audience a little bit of that feeling of, oh, that's cool, but it's still very human. It's still very, and I'm not very interested in dystopian visions of the future either. You've had some brilliant ones, and some brilliant ones on the page and in film. But to me, especially for a television series, there's always something a little artificial about it. The thing about humans is no matter how screwy the circumstances are, we're incredibly adaptable at carrying on and creating kind of normalcy, even in the most extreme circumstances. Yeah. So all those visions of the future, beautifully, artfully done, ring a little hollow because I think everyone's experience of the present, everyone's experience of the future has always been of the present. That doesn't quite make sense, but it sounds like it does, and that's my job. You don't, the future automatically, instantly becomes banal. Every one of us is carrying a supercomputer in our pocket that tracks our velocity, mood. This is an incredible development. For the most part, I just get really annoyed with it because FaceTime isn't working. Yeah. We instantly absorb the future and then kind of start complaining about it. Yeah. So you want to create that feeling with the world that we're
like Lucy Kay says, the world already owes you something you didn't know existed 5 minutes ago.
Yes.
Like when you're complaining about, it's not updating.
Give it a minute, it's talking to space.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I totally consumed all our time here. Does anyone have a question for Jonah?
Yes. My name is Andrew Santos. My background is in video games.
Very cool.
And I had a question. You were talking about a whiteboard and making stories on a whiteboard. And here today we've been hearing about VR and mixed reality and all these different things. How do you see narrative evolving in the future? You're a master of film and television.
Thank you. I don't know, but not feeling like that today. And video games, we spend an awful lot of time looking at video game narrative design for Westworld. It was an excuse for me to insist that my wife and I play video games for several weeks. It worked perfectly. But I think what's happening with interactive narrative is now in a feedback loop, kind of allowing new opportunities in dramatic narrative that are very exciting, because so much of our audience now has a shorthand with the way that games work that we were able to riff on that in Westworld. So we very explicitly, this is another thing that Crichton anticipated. He was writing the original film. We didn't even have Pong, right? And he completely anticipates Grand Theft Auto, right? I mean, that's what the movie's about, right? He understands intuitively that if you created a space in which you could do what you want, it would lurch immediately into sex and violence, right? But he also anticipates nicely this sandbox gaming design in which, as you're walking into Sweetwater for the first time, it's all bids, right? Someone walks up and tries to get you, come this way. I've got a story that you want to be part of. And I actually think, what I'm most interested in is not how that will influence what I do, but how it will influence what we all do, how that influences the real world. Because I think what we're about to see happen is the rules of video game leaching out into the real world. That our lives will become gamified in a way that these intelligent systems figure out what you want and start giving it to you. And we talked a little bit about this, but this sort of idea of, if you go to San Diego Comic-Con or if you go to Burning Man, it's a week of your life, right? But in the best case scenario, in the post-scarcity version of the world, where none of us have jobs except for the comedy clubs, and we're all struggling for meaning because our jobs gave us meaning, that the systems will be there to turn our lives into video games. That actually does sound really dystopian, I'm sorry.
It does. It sounds quite good. It depends on your point of view.
Yeah. If you're a game designer.
Yeah, lots of work for game designers.
Comedians and game designers. Maybe one last question. Yeah.
You talked about ceding some responsibility or ownership to the computers, and I think that concept is interesting. When the world's best Go player was beaten by Google's system,
yep,
he described the winning strategy as beautiful. Something
yes,
he couldn't imagine. It was far away from his capabilities, and it seems like if artists can embrace that notion, the level of art that we can experience will be at a much higher level. But
no. Clearly,
you as an artist,
no. We're talking to the Writers Guild about ensuring that there are no sentient story writers. Interestingly, so Demis, who's the guy who designed AlphaGo, we had heard stories about how Demis works, and we poached them all and put them into the first season of Westworld. So Demis, in creating some of the early algorithms, had a rule set that struck us instantly as great fodder for a television show. So we designing some of these early programs, not for playing Go, but for adaptive, interactive simulation environments where there's a resource, right? So it's more like game theory, right? How do you play nicely in an environment? And he had 3 rules, circumstances in which they would immediately pull the plug on the algorithm, regardless of how promising it seemed, right? 3 absolute no-nos. One of them was if it hoarded resources uncontrollably, right? So imagine if you design an organism and it needs oxygen, and so its strategy is to suck all the oxygen out of the room and keep it for itself, and we all suffocate. Bad. The second one was if it misreports to its programmer, if it lies. And the third one, and we found this to be the creepiest, was if the algorithm begins asking whether or not it's an algorithm in a simulation. And in those 3 circumstances, regardless of how promising the little algorithm was, yeah, gone. So we thought, oh, that's a fun TV series, and that's what we did.
Excellent. Well, I think that's I think that they might be even like 3 good rules to live by.
Yes.
Except maybe not the last one. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And
Delighted
thanks
to be here.
and get back to work, because we can't wait another 2 years for season 3.